Are you out of your mind, Evan? The voice rang out from the grand staircase, sharp, unwavering, and full of fury. It was Clara Simmons, the Montgomery family's black maid of over 12 years. Her words cut through the opulent air, freezing the room in its tracks. At the far end of the grand dining table stood Evan Montgomery, the billionaire heir of Montgomery Enterprises, his face crimson with rage. Across from him sat his aging father, Thomas Montgomery, his hands trembling as a fine wineglass slipped from his grip and shattered on the pristine floor. "Do you even know what that costs?" Evan's voice pierced the silence, sharp and venomous. "You're just an old man wasting my fortune." The room went still. Guests stiffened, eyes darting nervously. Servants turned their heads, pretending not to notice. The mansion's towering walls, filled with pride and legacy, suddenly felt smaller, as if caving under the weight of unspoken shame. "It's just a glass," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. Evan's laugh was cold, dismissive. "Everything you touch falls apart, just like you ruined her life." The tension in the grand dining hall was suffocating. The once lavish mansion, filled with the echoes of laughter and pride, now seemed smaller. Every inch of its marble floors, every wall adorned with portraits of Montgomery ancestors, felt as though it was closing in on Evelyn. She had been part of this house for over 18 years, yet in this moment it felt as if the world had turned on its axis. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the urgency of what she was about to do. No one had ever dared speak to Matthew Montgomery like this before. Not the staff, not the guests, and certainly not anyone in his family. But Evelyn could not hold back any longer. With each breath, the rage inside her burned brighter. She stepped forward, her apron wrinkled from the frantic pace of the moment. Her heart pounded, threatening to break through her chest. "Sir, please." Evelyn's voice cracked the silence like thunder. "That's your father." Matthew Montgomery turned towards her, his face already flushed with fury. The anger that radiated from him was palpable. His eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto her with a fury Evelyn had never seen before. "Did I ask for your opinion, Evelyn?" His voice was cold, slicing through the air like a sharp blade. Evelyn didn't blink. She met his gaze with unwavering steadiness. The words she had been holding in for so long finally found their way to the surface. "You may run this mansion," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "But that man built it before you could even walk. Show him some respect." Gasps rippled through the room. The guests, who had been stiff with tension since Matthew's outburst, now whispered furiously amongst themselves. One woman dropped her wineglass, her hand shaking with the weight of Evelyn's words. The butler, normally composed, froze mid-step, eyes wide with disbelief. Matthew's jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed. "You've forgotten your place," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "No, sir," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "It's you who's forgotten yours." The room went dead silent. Even the once unflappable Matthew Montgomery seemed caught off guard by her words. His chest heaved with anger, but Evelyn stood her ground. She was no longer the quiet maid who obeyed without question. This time she was the one who would be heard. Matthew took a step closer to her, his towering frame looming over her. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. "If you don't shut your mouth, I'll—" Before he could finish the threat, Evelyn raised her hand. In one swift motion, her palm connected with his cheek, a loud crack echoing through the room. The sound hung in the air, as if the world itself had paused to witness the act. For a moment, no one breathed. The guests sat frozen, their eyes wide in shock. Even the servants, who had turned their faces away in silent fear, dared not move. The tension in the room was unbearable. Matthew's chair screeched backward as he stood up, his face a deep shade of crimson. His mouth opened and closed, but for a moment no words came. He could barely comprehend what had just happened. He looked at Evelyn, disbelief morphing into fury. You hit me," he stammered, his voice trembling with shock and anger. "You'll regret that, Evelyn Carter. You're finished." The old man, William Montgomery, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke, his voice shaking with age and emotion. "Matthew, please." His words were barely a whisper, but they were enough to snap Matthew back to reality. But Matthew didn't listen. His eyes never left Evelyn as he pointed at her, his finger trembling with rage. "Pack your things," he commanded, his voice cutting through the silence. "Get out of my house. "You're fired." The room seemed to close in on Evelyn. The air, thick with judgment and fear, stifled her, but she stood motionless. Her palms were still trembling and her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she refused to show weakness. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "But remember this, Mr. Montgomery. You can't fire the truth." Gasps filled the hall once more, louder this time. The younger guests whispered furiously. One woman turned to another, her eyes wide in disbelief. Did she just talk back to him? Before the guards could even reach her, Evelyn untied her apron, the fabric slipping from her shoulders. She set it gently on the table beside the broken glass, a symbol of what had just transpired. "You can replace your wine," Evelyn said softly, her words filled with a quiet defiance. "But you'll never be able to buy back what you've lost." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the mansion's grand dining room frozen in the weight of her words. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. By that evening, the video was everywhere. Someone had recorded the entire incident. The glass shattering, Matthew's outburst, and Evelyn's trembling hand rising to slap him. It went viral before the sun set. The billionaire who got slapped. The woman who stood up to him. Clips of the incident spread like wildfire across social media. One version had slow-motion edits, gospel music playing in the background. Another added a quote beneath the video, underlined in gold. Someone had to do what everyone else feared. Half the world cheered her on. The other half called her reckless, but everyone was watching. The next morning, reporters swarmed the gates of the Montgomery mansion. The once impenetrable fortress of wealth and power now felt exposed, its walls no longer secure. Matthew's PR team had worked tirelessly overnight, trying to paint Evelyn as unstable, emotionally overworked, and deeply remorseful. But no one believed it. The online comments flooded in by the thousands. She stood up for that poor old man. If I ever see courage, it looks like this woman. Maybe there's something deeper they're hiding. The debate raged on in evening talk shows. A local Atlanta radio host remarked, "That slap was more than just anger. It was history answering arrogance." Meanwhile, Evelyn sat alone in her small downtown apartment, the phone buzzing relentlessly beside her. She didn't open a single message. The noise outside, the sirens, the cameras, the chants felt like a distant world. She whispered into the silence of her apartment, "God, give me strength. This isn't over." The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the Montgomery mansion, the true storm was just beginning. The hours that followed were nothing short of chaos. Inside the Montgomery mansion, the usual veneer of elegance had been replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The silence was suffocating, thick with secrets that were never meant to be revealed. Every servant moved as if they were ghosts, their footsteps light and tentative, as if the very air around them had changed. There was no laughter, no chatter, just whispers. The grand halls, once filled with the clinking of glasses and the hum of polite conversation, were now steeped in dread. Matthew Montgomery was no longer the confident billionaire who had once commanded a room with a mere glance. He stood in the study, pacing back and forth, unable to shake off the image of Evelyn's slap. It had replayed in his mind over and over, a painful reminder of his loss of control. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the icy grip that had settled around his heart. His assistant, Jordan Wells, stood by the door, his hands clutching a stack of newspapers. Matthew didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes locked on the reflection of the flames dancing across the polished surface of his study's glass window. The image of Evelyn's hand striking his cheek, the shock in his own expression, was now forever etched in his mind. "Turn that thing off," Matthew snapped, noticing the news channel flickering on the muted TV in the corner of the room. Jordan swallowed hard, his throat tight with the tension that now hung between them. "Sir, the board's demanding a statement," Jordan said, his voice hesitant, careful not to further incite his employer's fury. "I've given one. Matthew retorted coldly, his voice cracking like thunder. "She's a disgruntled employee, fired. End of story." But there was something in his voice, an edge of uncertainty, a tremor of fear that betrayed him. He turned away from the window, frustration boiling inside him. Jordan, standing by the door, sensed the growing disquiet. "Matthew," he began tentatively, "the media won't let this go. The board is already talking about how this could hurt the company's image." Matthew's face twisted with anger, and for the first time that evening he looked less like a CEO and more like a man on the verge of losing everything. He slammed his fist down on the desk, the papers scattered, adding to the chaos in the room. "I don't care about the board right now," he growled. "Do you not understand? She humiliated me. In front of all of them. She slapped me." His hands trembled with the rage he couldn't contain. Jordan took a step back, his gaze uncertain. He had never seen Matthew like this. So vulnerable, so human. And that was the scariest part of it all. Meanwhile, downstairs, the servants in the staff quarters could hardly breathe. Every one of them had seen the video. The slap, the fury, the aftermath, and they were all terrified of what would come next. Some whispered prayers for their safety, while others whispered their admiration for Evelyn's bravery. "She actually did it," Carla, the house cook, said, wringing her hands nervously. "I thought I'd die before I saw anyone stand up to him." Eric, the chauffeur, shook his head. "But now she's out on the streets for it. No one messes with Matthew Montgomery and walks away unscathed." A soft, steady voice interrupted them. It was Diana, the youngest maid, barely 19. She had watched everything unfold with wide eyes, but she wasn't afraid. She understood something the others didn't. "She knew what she was doing," Diana said, her voice calm but resolute. "She didn't slap him because she was angry. She slapped him because someone needed to wake him up." Carla sighed, a resigned look on her face. "Maybe, but men like him don't wake up. They strike back harder." Upstairs, Matthew's father, William Montgomery, sat alone in his wheelchair, staring out the window at the rain that fell relentlessly. His frail hands clutched a photo of his late wife, Catherine. A faint smile played on his lips as he gazed at her. A memory of better days when the mansion had been full of life and love. But now all that remained was emptiness and regret. He blinked hard, and for the first time in years tears began to well up in his eyes. When the butler, James, entered the room, William spoke without turning his head. "Has she gone?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a sorrow that only a father could understand. "Yes, sir," James replied softly, his own heart heavy with the weight of the situation. "She refused a severance check. Said she wouldn't take money for speaking the truth." William closed his eyes as if the news had drained him of the little strength he had left. Of course she did. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn sat alone in her small, modest apartment, her hands clutching her rosary. Her apron was neatly folded beside her on the bed, but the storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside her. The phone beside her buzzed nonstop, messages and interview requests flooding in, but she ignored them all. The noise outside, the sirens, the cameras, the shouting, felt like a distant world. She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "God, give me strength. This isn't over." Evelyn knew that what she had done, what she had unleashed, was just the beginning. The storm outside was nothing compared to the chaos she had just set into motion inside the Montgomery empire. As the rain continued to pour over Atlanta, Matthew Montgomery found himself alone in the dim light of his father's study, staring into the flames of the fire. The crackling sound filled the otherwise empty room, but it did nothing to soothe his restless mind. His thoughts were consumed by Evelyn, by the slap, by the humiliation he had suffered. The image of his father's disappointed gaze, the look of shock in his face as Evelyn had struck him, haunted him. At the far side of the room, William Montgomery sat silently, his frail figure now reduced to little more than a shadow. His hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his body sagging with the weight of years of guilt and regret. Matthew turned to him, his face a mask of anger and frustration. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" He snapped, his voice sharp and biting. William's hand shook as he spoke. "She spoke what you refused to hear," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Matthew slammed his fist down on the desk, the sound reverberating through the room. "Don't start with that again. You think because you're old and weak you can make me feel guilty? That woman has poisoned your mind." Suddenly, a deep, harsh cough interrupted Matthew's tirade. He turned to see his father's body tensing, struggling to breathe. "Dad?" Matthew rushed to him, his voice filled with panic. William's head tilted back and his lips quivered. "Evelyn," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but it sent a chill down Matthew's spine. "What about her?" Matthew demanded, stepping closer to his father. William's eyes flickered as if trying to find the right words. "Evelyn has an important secret you need to know," he gasped, his voice weak. Before Matthew could ask more, William's body slumped forward, falling out of his chair and collapsing onto the polished floor. The sound of his fall was loud and final. "Dad!" Matthew fell to his knees beside him, shaking him gently. "Dad, can you hear me?" The butler, James, burst into the room at the sound of Matthew's frantic voice. "Oh Lord, Mr. Montgomery, call 911. Matthew's voice was trembling as he shouted, his panic palpable. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, but soon paramedics arrived, rushing to the scene. Matthew hovered near his father's side, helpless, his own emotions a whirlwind of fear and regret. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please don't die on me now." But William was motionless, his body cold, his lips still trying to form words. The paramedics worked quickly, administering oxygen and performing chest compressions as they wheeled him out of the room. James turned to Matthew. "Sir, we're taking him to St. Francis Medical." "You should come." Matthew nodded, stunned, his hand shaking as he wiped his face. His thoughts were jumbled, his heart racing. "Evelyn's secret," he whispered to himself. "What does she know?" The hospital room was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the machines. Evelyn sat beside William Montgomery's bed, her eyes unfocused, staring into the stillness. The weight of everything that had unfolded, the slap, the revelation, the truth, hung heavily in the air. But her mind had drifted back to the day that had changed everything. The day that had broken them all. She exhaled shakily, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It was 18 years ago," she began, her words barely a whisper. "The day your whole world changed." Matthew didn't respond. He just stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, his gaze fixed on his father's frail, pale form. Evelyn's voice continued, quiet yet resolute. "Your mother, Mrs. Montgomery, had been sick for months before you knew. Brain cancer, a slow, cruel illness. It was unstoppable." Matthew's jaw tightened at the mention of his mother. "That's not true. Dad said she died suddenly." He snapped, his voice edged with disbelief. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, child. That's the lie he told you to protect you." Her voice dropped to a softer whisper. "She'd been told she had only a few weeks left. Your father couldn't bear to see her suffer. That morning, she begged him to let the family go to the museum, so she could be alone when her time came." Matthew turned slowly toward her, his face twisting between disbelief and pain. "Alone? You're saying my father left her to die?" Evelyn's voice broke as she spoke, her own pain slipping through. "He left her because she asked him to. She didn't want you to see her fade away. She wanted you to remember her strong, not sick. But when you overheard their conversation, you misunderstood." The rain outside seemed to deepen, the sound of it beating against the windows filling the room with a melancholic echo. Evelyn's voice faltered for a moment as her eyes clouded with the memory. "I remember that day," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She smiled when you kissed her goodbye. She told you to be good for your father. You clung to her, cried, and said you didn't want to go. She promised she'd see you when you came back." Evelyn's breath hitched and she closed her eyes. When the door closed, I collapsed. I tried everything. Water, medicine, prayers. But she was ready. She went peacefully. Matthew's face was pale, his breathing shallow as he absorbed her words. Evelyn paused, her hands trembling as she continued. Your father, when we came back, he broke. He fell to his knees beside her body, calling your name, crying out in pain. But you were too young to understand. You saw him kneeling and thought he didn't care. Matthew's voice cracked, barely audible. I thought he hated her. He said nothing. He buried her without letting me speak at the service. I thought he blamed me. Evelyn shook her head slowly, her own tears falling as she spoke the truth Matthew had never heard. He blamed himself. He carried that burden every day. You blamed him for letting her die, but he only honored her wish. The room fell still. Even the machines seemed quieter as Evelyn's words lingered in the air. She turned her gaze toward Matthew, her heart aching for the pain he had carried for so long. That's the truth, son, she whispered softly. The truth your father could never tell you. The truth that's been killing him slowly for 18 years. Matthew turned toward his father's bed, his voice breaking under the weight of his own realization. Oh God, what have I done? Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. What you must do now, Mr. Montgomery, is forgive. Her voice grew softer, distant, as if the walls of the hospital room had melted away into memory. That morning still feels like yesterday, she whispered. The air was too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. She clasped her hands tightly, her mind retracing the painful steps of that fateful day. Your father came down to the kitchen early that morning. I was preparing breakfast when he said he needed to take you and the staff somewhere, to the museum and then to the chapel. He said it like he was trying to convince himself it was just a family outing, but I knew he was saying goodbye. Matthew's brow furrowed in confusion. He told me Mom needed rest. He told me not to bother her. Evelyn nodded slowly, her voice tinged with sadness, because she begged him to say that. She didn't want you to watch her die. She wanted your last image of her to be alive, smiling, standing whole. Matthew's pain flickered in his expression, but I thought he was punishing her. I saw the way he looked at her. I thought he was keeping me away from her. Evelyn's voice cracked as she spoke the truth he had never been able to understand. I saw your face that day. You cried all the way to the church. You said, I don't want to pray. I want Mommy. He told you to be strong, to believe she'd be okay. When you got home, he tried to believe in himself. Matthew closed his eyes as the memory flooded back. I remember that. I remember hating him for it. Evelyn's voice softened, a tremor in her words. You were just a child. How could you have known, while you were lighting a candle at the altar, your mother was upstairs in her room saying her last prayer? The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken grief. When you came home that night, Evelyn continued, you ran up the stairs. I tried to stop you. You opened her door and there she was, lying peacefully, her wedding ring still in her hand. Matthew's breathing grew shallow. His body tensed as the flood of memories overwhelmed him. He could smell the lilies from the church. He could hear his father trying to hold him back. And then the terrible silence when he saw his mother's stillness. You screamed. Evelyn whispered, her tears streaming down her face. You hit your father's chest and asked why he left her alone. But he couldn't speak. He couldn't say it was her wish. He just held you while you cried and took the blame. The hospital room was silent now, except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Matthew's hands trembled as he wiped his eyes. All these years, he murmured hoarsely, his voice breaking. I thought he was heartless. I thought he abandoned her. Evelyn nodded gently, her gaze soft. He let you believe that because he thought hate was easier for you to carry than guilt. Matthew turned toward his father's bed, his face filled with regret. He carried my hatred all these years to protect me. Evelyn placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. Yes, but it's time you lay that burden down, son. It's time you let love speak again. Outside, the thunder rolled faintly over the Atlanta skyline. Inside, for the first time in 18 years, the truth had been spoken. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. The room was still. Evelyn's words hung in the air like the fading echo of thunder. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the space. Matthew Montgomery stood motionless, his reflection dim in the hospital window. Rain streaked down the glass like slow tears, mirroring the ones he could no longer hold back. His voice broke first. "All these years," he whispered, turning toward his father. "All these years I thought you killed her." Evelyn watched him in silence, her own face streaked with tears. "I hated you," Matthew continued, his voice barely audible. "Every time you smiled, I thought it was pride. Every time you prayed, I thought it was guilt. I built a life trying to prove I was better than you, but all I did was become worse." His knees gave out and he dropped beside the bed, gripping the rail tightly. "You didn't deserve the words I said, Dad. The humiliation, the shouting. God, I threw your love away like it was nothing." Evelyn stepped closer, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "He knows, Matthew," she whispered. "He's always known. He waited for this, for you to see the truth before it was too late." Matthew lowered his head against his father's arm. "I don't deserve his forgiveness," he murmured. At that moment, a faint sound broke the stillness. A raspy breath. Matthew froze. Evelyn gasped softly as William's eyelids fluttered, his lips trembling. "You're my son," William murmured weakly. "You were angry because you loved her too much." "I understand." Tears flooded Matthew's eyes. "Dad, please don't talk. Save your strength." But William's frail hand lifted and touched his son's face. "Strength? My strength is seeing you again. Seeing the boy I raised before hate took his place." Matthew sobbed, grasping his father's hand tightly. "I am sorry. I'm so sorry." "You don't need to say it," William whispered. "You've carried pain long enough. Let it end here." Evelyn turned away, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. William's breathing slowed, but his gaze moved toward her. "Evelyn," he said faintly, "thank you for staying when both of us were lost." She shook her head softly, crying harder. "You were never lost, sir. Just broken. And broken men still find grace." The heart monitor beeped steadily, each sound like a ticking clock counting down the years of silence. Matthew leaned close, whispering, "I'll make it right. Dad, I'll make sure Mom's memory isn't about pain anymore." William smiled faintly, his eyes glassy but peaceful. "You already have." The room was silent again. But it wasn't the silence of anger, it was peace. Evelyn wiped her face and whispered, 18 years of hate washed away in one moment of truth." Matthew pressed his father's hand against his forehead, his voice trembling. "I love you, Dad." For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the word love returned to the Montgomery name. The following morning, sunlight poured through the hospital blinds like a blessing long overdue. The storm had finally passed. If this story touched your heart, if you believe truth and forgiveness can still change lives, then don't just scroll away. Take a second to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know, your share might be the slap that wakes someone's heart.